On this last day of our gathering, I'm happy to welcome our final speaker, Anna Keating. Anna is the writer of the Catholic Catalog, which many of you may have heard of. It's a field guide to the daily acts that make up a Catholic life. There will actually be copies of this available for purchase. She's also the coordinator of Catholic Life at Colorado College. Her essays have appeared in U.S. Catholic, First Things, Salon, America, Notre Dame Magazine, Commonweal, NPR, and our own Church Life Journal. She's a highly sought-after speaker who somehow integrates Catholic life with the rest of her existence. So we're delighted to have her speak to us on this final topic, Jesus Christ in the Domestic Church. Please join me in welcoming Anna Keating.
Wow, you guys really know how to do morning prayer. Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here with you today. To be here with the people who do the work of evangelization and being the church every single day. As Tim mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about encountering Jesus in the domestic church, and I'm going to look at that through the lenses of community, imperfection, and playfulness. And I'm going to be speaking about this for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion about how to apply these ideas in the communities from which you came. It's 10 o'clock at night, the kids are asleep, and my husband and I are in the midst of a massive fight that has somehow spilled out of our house and into the backyard. We're yelling at each other, words born of anger, each of us too hurt and ashamed to back down. And like the majority of our very worst fights, I don't even remember what started it. I just remember how awful it felt. My husband and I own a small business, and at the time we were working long hours, often late into the night. And we were having cash flow issues, which is a polite way of saying that we were out of cash. We also have little kids, so we were probably sleep deprived. Obviously, we'd had a bad day. None of this justifies our behavior, it just gives it context. We're sinners with an anger problem. And while I don't remember what started our fight that day, I do remember what stopped it. We live next to an old apartment building, and our kindly, elderly, alcoholic, African-American neighbor, Alan, leaned out of his upstairs balcony and yelled, "Hey, are you okay?" And in a quiet voice, my husband said, "No, we're not." And that was it. It was over. We went back inside, apologized, and went to sleep, albeit in different rooms for the night. And the next morning, we resolved to do better with God's grace. All this because my neighbor acted like a neighbor in the biblical sense. He loved us when we were not deserving of it. He inserted himself into our mess. He was a good Samaritan. He didn't call the police. He didn't berate us. He just asked us if we needed him to come down so that we could have someone else to talk to. And he didn't act weird or judgmental when he saw us the next day. He simply said, "Are you okay?" When we were plainly not. And that was enough. The love of neighbor in all its fullness is sometimes boiled down to asking, what are you going through? Because the question restores some of our dignity, and it reminds us that we're not alone. God acts in the Christian story through other people. Often people like my neighbor Alan, a veteran who served time and now works odd jobs as a handyman. Beautiful and imperfect Alan, who was once Christ to me. My husband and I have learned how to fight better and less, but occasionally we still fight. But that day with Alan on the porch taught me that I'm not as alone as I sometimes like to think. It taught me that the world of my family or my domestic church doesn't end at my front or back door. It is not encapsulated by my husband and me and our 2 children. The American idea of family, the nuclear family, or the independent, autonomous individual is way too small. When my husband is having a bad day now, when I'm mad as hell at something he said, and I feel like taking all of his clothes and burning them in the front yard, I call my in-laws who love us both. They live 3 blocks away. They have been married for 52 years. I say, "Hey, please call your son. He's having a bad day." And it helps every time. This is not to say that my marriage is simply an act of bearing suffering patiently. On most days, my relationship with my husband is my greatest source of joy. He is a blessing in my life, not just my supporter, but my champion and my best friend. And we have built a life together that is better than anything I could have imagined. But much like my life of faith, my married life can sometimes be complicated and messy and hard, and I don't want to pretend that it's not. Because the perfect family is an idol. We need to speak about this in our parishes and our communities. There is no such thing as a perfect husband or a perfect wife. As Pope Francis says, it's just us sinners. And my marriage thrives not only because of the deep love that my husband and I have for one another, but also, and maybe primarily, because we live in the midst of a community of people that support it. Our relatives, our friends, our kids, our neighbors, our church. I tell you this story of one of the lowest moments of my life because so often I think what keeps people from encountering Jesus in the home or being creative in imagining what they want their domestic church to look like is the idea that religious practices are the purview of the perfect or the scrupulous, the kind of people who seem to need them the least, or at least need them for different reasons. We sometimes think of faith in the home as an added bonus for people who already have their shit together. But Jesus tells us that he didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. This way of life, these practices are not a cudgel, but a gift. And the domestic church does not simply refer to discrete moments of prayer in the home, a family rosary, for instance, but to our entire lives outside of the Mass. Go in peace, glorifying the Lord with your lives. God's love is unconditional, so we don't just encounter it when we're doing a great job. In fact, the full revelation of God's love for us is made known in the resurrection. That is, after we have become his murderers, after we have killed him, you and I. The Easter story is not a very nice story, but it is a true one. So we need to rediscover community, and we need to know that life lived in relationship is not going to be about perfection. It's going to be about faithfulness. As Pope Francis says, peace in the home is artisanal. You work at it every day. Or as Chesterton says about raising children, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. It's going to take practice and require sacrifice and involve failure, but we have to give it a shot. As Mother Teresa tells us, God does not require that we be successful, only that we be faithful. But by letting people like Alan, my friends and my family, and all of you into my marriage and my life as it really is, I'm learning how to not only be in a better relationship with my husband, but how to be a better person, a better Catholic, how to love more patiently and faithfully, how to pray for someone I'm furious at, how to better live and express what isn't a contract between two consenting adults, but what is a sacrament meant to participate and be an expression of God's love for us. And I try not to go too hard on myself or on the people I'm in communion with, because I believe that we can learn just as much from our failures as from our successes. Unfortunately, my kids aren't going to get two parents who have never had a fight. But maybe I can give them two parents who, when they do fight, even sometimes in front of them, reconcile in front of them too, and ask them for forgiveness. Because God appears between beings, and his name is mercy. And if it isn't already abundantly clear, I say all of this as someone who is not very good at living in community. My idea of a really great afternoon is being left alone in a room by myself to write. When I was 22 at Notre Dame and engaged to be married, my now husband told me that he was committed to the idea that his parents, who were poor and elderly and had chronic health issues, would come with us wherever we went. He even floated the idea of an intergenerational household, rejecting the way that we outsource the care of our elders. But I'm going to tell you the truth, which is that I was afraid. I was afraid that I would be less happy, less successful, less free if I had to take care of them. I thought that they would be a burden. Little did I know that they would be the ones again and again taking care of me, taking care of us, or that I would be the one seeking them out for conversation when the afternoons with the kids seemed long. We started a small business in their basement. They watched my baby when I co-wrote my book, The Catholic Catalog, A Field Guide to the Daily Acts That Make Up a Catholic Life. And my mother-in-law is now one of my closest friends. I have learned from her that love does not grow in isolation or without suffering. It grows in proximity, and in my experience, in shared adversity. When I had my appendix out, my father-in-law came to the hospital and prayed over me charismatic style before they wheeled me to the operating room. When our basement was flooding, he stood in water up to his knees and helped carry bucket after bucket of water up the stairs. Love like that changes you. The change is slow, but real. In American culture, freedom is about autonomy, literally being a law unto oneself. And it's about privacy. I can do whatever I want, as long as it doesn't impact anybody else. How miserable to believe that your life impacts no one. How patently untrue, when in fact we are all interconnected from the moment of our conception. There is an epidemic of loneliness in this country. 1 in 3 American adults identifies as chronically lonely, up from 1 in 5 a decade ago. An overwhelming amount of literature has been written on the breakdown of community in the United States, from Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam to Alone Together by Sherry Turkle. And we all know that young people are less connected than ever before to religion, extended family, a sense of place, or meaningful labor. And of course, as our social ties have been weakened, the suicide rate has also increased. Suicides for Americans 35 to 54 increased 30% between 1999 and 2010. Often our culture overlooks the role that communal religious practices can play in public health and well-being. Communal religious practices boost immunity and decrease blood pressure. They also increase pro-social behavior like volunteering and doing well in school. One Harvard study showed that going to church once a week reduced mortality, not morality, I hope, mortality, by 20 to 30% over a 15-year period. Don't get me wrong, I am a Christian, I am a Catholic because I believe that the Christian story is true. But I am also a Christian because I get something out of it. I get to live in communion, in relationship with God and the saints. I get to be loved by Jesus as I am and to lay down my burdens at his feet. And this, too, is a form of community. According to a study published by JAMA Psychiatry, women who attend religious services at least once a week are 5 times less likely to commit suicide. And among the 7,000 devout Catholic women who were studied who attended Mass more than once a week, there was not a single suicide over a 20-year period. Lisa Miller of Columbia University's Teacher College has found that spiritually connected children and adolescents are 60% less likely to suffer from depression, 40% less likely to abuse drugs or alcohol, and 80% less likely to have unprotected sex. And yet, she has difficulty finding an audience for her research. At psychology conferences, people walked out during her presentations. Our faith, properly understood, is about following Christ. But it is also a set of practices and a way of life that begins in the home and that can provide buffers against loneliness, isolation, nihilism, hatred of the other, and despair. Not in every case, of course, but in many cases. And yet, of course, these ancient practices are in danger of being lost. Only 16% of American Catholics under 40 regularly attend Mass, and only 40% of American children regularly pray before meals. Young Catholics whose parents attend Mass, talk to their children about their faith in the home, and live their beliefs in their daily lives, in other words, those who have a domestic church, are the most likely to practice their faith in adulthood and to experience these subsequent benefits. In American culture, however, autonomy is sacred. I can do whatever I want. I can believe whatever I want. But any religious practice, any discipline or sport or craft is going to require engaging with or being ruled by a reality independent of oneself. As Matthew Crawford writes, the self comes into view in a situation not of its own making. If you're a marathoner or a distance runner, you can't just show up for the race without training or quit at the 3-mile mark. You have to discipline yourself. You have to cultivate the virtue of self-denial in order to push past what feels good, in order to do something that feels even better. Even when that which feels better, that which is ultimately more rewarding, can feel like suffocating. There was a point in each of my labors when I turned to my husband and said, I can't do this. And he said, you have to. My babies were going to be born whether I liked it or felt like it or not. I had to almost literally go to battle for them. And only in a situation of such firm limits was I able to realize my own strength or potential, what I am capable of. Thomas Merton famously described his monastic cell as the 4 walls of my freedom. We need to think about good limits, healthy limits in the home as joyful things that allow for human flourishing. As Chesterton said, Catholic doctrine and discipline may be walls, but they are the walls of a playground. We Catholics hold on to practices and people and a way of life that the world would just as soon throw away or walk out on. And at the heart of this life must be domestic churches, home churches, where we can worship something other than ourselves, and where the terrible disease of loneliness can be cured. In fact, without these way stations, a life of faith is no longer tenable. If there are no Catholic homes, pretty soon there won't be any Catholics. We will have been assimilated. So our lives must become places of communion with our true selves, with one another, with God and the saints, and with our beloved dead. My husband Jeffrey had a brother named Patrick who died as an infant. We have a framed picture of him on our shelf. And one day, not too long ago, my 5-year-old pulled it off the shelf and asked to hear baby Patrick's story. And after hearing it, he said, we should pray for him. So we got down Catholic household blessings and prayers, and we did. St. John Chrysostom says, let us not hesitate to help those who have died and to offer prayers for them. It is for reasons such as these, the need to provide an alternative to a culture of isolation and hopelessness, that we need to rediscover the domestic church, what Pope Benedict XVI called the primary sphere of the church's life, especially because of its decisive role in the Christian education of children. In fact, all of the popes since Vatican II have described the home as a church or a school of love, a place for God's people, his body, to learn fidelity, hospitality, how to share, how to regulate emotions, still working on that one, how to pray, to forgive, to care for creation, contribute to the common good. It's all connected. Pope John Paul II said the family called together by word and sacrament is the church of the home, as the church of the home is both teacher and mother, the same as the worldwide church. We cannot count on our parishes to do all of the work. They're not set up for that, nor have they ever been. Nor can we count on our schools or public figures. When the President of the United States, who is not a Christian, speaks of himself as a Christian, it is very easy for our children and people disconnected from religion to become cynical or confused. We must keep the faith alive in our homes, trusting that we have been given the grace to do so by our baptism. Pope Francis tells us that the only thing required for evangelization is baptism. When the Catholic faith was expelled from Japan, when the last priests were martyred and driven from the country, the faith remained alive in secret for 200 years. Who did the work of baptism, catechesis, and Christian burial for 200 years? Pope Francis tells us that it was the baptized. It was the domestic church. And this is not about spiritual pride or saving others. This is simply about trying to love the God who first loved me. In the process of co-writing my book, The Catholic Catalog, I discovered that the person I had evangelized, big surprise, was myself. So how can we imagine or reimagine what community and communal life is going to look like in the 21st century and what might the domestic churches of the future look like. Let me share with you just some of my own story, only in the hope that it will allow you to reflect upon your own or on the stories of the people that you minister to. When I was married in my early 20s, I lived far away from my extended family, and I liked it that way. I needed space and time to figure out who I was and what I wanted my life to look like. And I think it's okay, helpful even, to take some time away from the community from which you came in order to discern your path. Still, in those early years of my marriage and adult life, and even now, I often felt like my Catholic identity was at war with my American one, or at least it was an uneasy alliance. Notre Dame had taught me that other people were a threat to my freedom and future success, except, of course, friendships of utility. The Notre Dame family and the words networking come to mind. Whereas in the Catholic tradition, I was taught that I was supposed to discover myself in introspection and contemplation, yes, but also in relationship and in service to God and neighbor. However, and this is crucial, I wasn't without community in those years away from my extended family in Colorado. I went to St. Joseph's Parish here in South Bend, and I taught classics at Trinity in Ecumenical High School, and I was blessed, beyond blessed, to have the formative experience of praying morning prayer every morning with all the women and girls in the high school where I worked. I learned so much from praying the Psalms and hearing women of faith preach on the Gospels 5 days a week for years. I developed a deep friendship during that time with a fellow teacher named Ruth Sanford, a funny, irreverent mother of 8 and grandmother of 15 who had taught every single subject in the school. She told me things that were so prescient that I still think about them all the time, things I couldn't yet understand. For example, when I was disappointed that I had to keep working in order to pay our bills and couldn't go back to graduate school, she said, "Maybe it will be a gift for your writing." Or when I was worried about taking care of my in-laws someday, and she told me, "Anna, God doesn't give you the grace you need for tomorrow today. He gives you the grace for today. You get it one day at a time." Ruth used to tell me that the difficult relationships in my life were opportunities to grow in holiness. But she didn't say it in some pious or dismissive way. She said it with laughter and resignation, like a Southerner says, "Lord, have mercy." It was during this time when I was teaching high school that my husband decided to stop work on his dissertation and start a handmade furniture business. He would often come home after I was in bed and leave before I woke up. He had to work long hours 7 days a week, and every penny we made went into machines and sandpaper. Getting a business off the ground was all-consuming, and he was seldom home. People would tell me, "Woodworking is a fine hobby, but no way to support a family." And I would tell them that I had a job that paid our bills. Until I didn't, because I had to quit my job to care for our newborn who was sick, and we were extra broke, and I was terribly lonely. I missed teaching, I rarely saw another adult, and I had a sick baby who cried all the time. We were unhappy with our situation, and we knew we had to make a change, so we started dreaming once again about a work-live scenario and moving closer to my family. And eventually we found a house in my hometown of Colorado Springs where we could have the furniture studio downstairs and our family and my work in the apartment above. The upstairs hadn't been lived in for over 30 years, and we'd have to do all the work on it ourselves, gutting and rebuilding it, but it was our chance, and so we took it. We were trying to create a domestic church, although we wouldn't have used that language at the time. We had a lot of ideas that looked good on paper. We'd studied Catholic social teaching on economics, distributist writers like Chesterton and Block, Peter Morin, and Dorothy Day. We knew what the church teaches about economics, that it should serve human relationships, not the other way around. We knew that private property was a good, but that we're stewards, not owners, and maximizing one's profits can never be the only goal. As Chesterton writes in Three Foes of the Family, a passage worth quoting at length if you'll permit me, "It cannot be too often repeated that what destroyed the family in the modern world was capitalism. No doubt it might have been communism. But so far as we are concerned, what has broken up households and encouraged divorces and treated the old domestic virtues with more and more open contempt is the epic and power of capitalism. It is capitalism that has forced a moral feud and a commercial competition between the sexes, that has destroyed the influence of the parent in favor of the influence of the employer, that has driven men from their homes to look for jobs, that has forced them to live near their factories or their firms instead of near their families, and above all, that has encouraged, for commercial reasons, a parade of publicity and garish novelty, which is in its nature the death of all that was called dignity and modesty by our mothers and fathers. And yet the Catholic solution for Chesterton and his ilk is not to abandon business or industry, but to reimagine it on a smaller and more human scale. He wrote, "Too much capitalism does not mean too many capitalists, but too few." My husband and I were being swallowed up by the demands of contemporary existence, in danger of becoming another statistic. We wanted to own a family business that wasn't a part of the problem. And at the same time, we wanted to put our family, our faith, our values, and our relationships at the very center of our life. As is often the case, moving from abstract ideals to practice proved difficult. To give but one tiny example, very few buildings are zoned in such a way that a family can own a one-man shop and actually live above it. We battled government bureaucrats and regulations and almost got shut down a dozen times with our life savings and then some tied up in the process. It was hard to be allowed to live a retro kind of life. And rather than living our ideals, we often felt like we were failing on every front. We wanted to be leaven for good in the world, but we were just a stressed out mess with poor credit. In the end, we fought for it and we figured it out. Each battle, like renovating the unit above the shop to make it livable while taking care of our baby, forcing us to reaffirm our commitment to a different kind of life than the one we had grown up with, a more intentional kind of life. Now, these days, we share a life. Working from home has changed our relationship in dramatic ways. We can work long hours when we need to and still be in each other's daily life. I pick up my daughter from Mother's Morning Out at First Methodist Church, and she eats her PB&J with her daddy before we take her and put her down for her nap. My son is playing basketball in the backyard. The neighbors come over and play too, and we can stop what we're doing if we want and watch him or play. And his cousins, who live in town, are his closest friends. Moving back home, living and working in the same building, we all just got to know each other a lot better. I was no longer the stay-at-home mom with a baby, and the more time we spent together, the easier it became for us to know how to just be in each other's presence, because our understanding grew, our empathy grew. Before, when we went to separate buildings for work all day, we'd come home and tell each other about our days, but we didn't really understand what the other person was going through. I didn't know what it took to build a table, and my husband did not know what it took to direct a play. Now I can see him sweating to fix a broken machine all day, and sometimes I even remember to give him a little bit of space in the evenings as a result. In the same way, he can hear if our daughter is having a tantrum and walk upstairs and ask if I need a break. American homes have been reduced to places where we sleep and store our stuff. We don't actually spend very much time there, even in the evenings. The home cannot be a place where our faith is expressed and learned and taught, unless it is first a place of charity and encounter. Hospitality, which the home is meant to provide, is established in the Old Testament as a sacred duty. Because for Christians, to welcome the stranger, as we all know, is to welcome Christ. And sometimes the stranger is a member of your own household. Darling child, must you slam the door when it is time for you to go to bed? People say that you can love from a distance, and I think that's true. But it is harder, because love is a verb. It's an action. In the Acts of the Apostles, the question isn't, what do you think? Or how do you feel about that? It's how then shall we live? When we bless our homes on Epiphany, when we sprinkle each room with holy water and pray that all who enter will be treated with dignity and love, we pray that those who come into our homes might find, as the Magi did at the end of their journey, the true and ever-living Christ. We pray for these things not to tell God what a great job we're doing, but because we know of our weakness and our need. To truly see each other in the domestic church, we need to waste time with one another. Why do we take it for granted that every member of a household should spend the majority of their waking hours in a separate building? Historically speaking, this is new. In a subsistence economy, families worked together, side by side. I think this is part of why American university students, at least at the college where I work, love to go abroad. They yearn to go to exotic places where people still live cheek to jowl, where there's still a sense of story that goes beyond shopping. In many developing countries, intergenerational living is still the norm. Ancient religious practices are still the norm. Hospitality to strangers is still the norm. Although these two are threatened as we export our more expedient way of life. Working and living in the same building, my husband and I talk more, and we share more of the work of caretaking. There's a toddler wearing noise-canceling headphones walking around the shop. We have friends over for beers on the back porch, and our kids play in the yard. All kinds of people come over and hang out, from our trash man to electricians and plumbers to the Colorado College hockey team to artists and priests. We have 14 immediate relatives within walking distance. 7 more up the road in Denver. It's messy and beautiful and a balancing act. We have to learn how to give each other space, but also how to share it. And we have to resolve conflicts more quickly because we're going to see each other more frequently. I do campus ministry now at Colorado College, the liberal arts school across the street, and my students come over for dinner once a week. My kids know them, and they know what their parents do for work, for income, because they've grown up working and playing alongside it. Of course, working from home isn't a feasible or maybe even an ideal option for many people. There's a lot of ways to do this, but it is becoming more common. The number of Americans who work from home at least one day a week has risen 40% in the last decade. 1 in 5 Americans now work from home, and that number is expected to rise by 63% in the next 10 years. I can just say from my own experience that it has created a situation in my life in which a domestic church has been allowed to flourish and take root. To paraphrase Peter Morin, we tried to create a new type of home, which was actually old, in which it was easier to be good. We need playfulness and imagination. I think we have dangerously small imaginations when it comes to picturing what a wild and holy life can look like. And I want to stress that there is not only one way. Everybody's domestic church is going to look a little bit different. I really do want to stress this. Again, the emphasis needs to be on faithfulness, not perfection. Creativity, imagination, playfulness, not uniformity. It's supposed to be fun. God meets us where we are, and even the smallest acts do important work. The single mom who quickly blesses her kids with the sign of the cross before she lets them out for school in the morning is creating a domestic church just as much as the homeschooling mother of a large family who sews her kids' Juan Diego costume for the Feast of All Saints. Or the single professional who hands out care kits to the homeless people on her commute or teaches catechesis of the Good Shepherd. They're each trying to repair the world in their own way, to insert their own lives, their own stories into the story of the gospel and to live their baptism. Look at the Catholic parish model for inspiration. All Roman Catholic churches pray the same prayers, have the same sacraments, and hear the same readings every day. And yet each is radically different. The universal church is a monolith, but it is an extremely diverse monolith. There are fundamental principles, and Christ is the measure, but those principles are instantiated in very different ways. And that is as it should be, because goodness is infinite. It is varied. This past December 23rd, I went to my sister Mary Margaret's house with my kids, my parents, and my 4 siblings, my nieces and nephews, and we sang carols and hymns in her living room. It was the high point of the Christmas season for me. a much more prayerful experience than the long and overcrowded Mass on Christmas Eve or the frenzied exchange of presents on Christmas Day. I encountered God there, in the voices and the hymn texts and the children and the cats roaming in and out as we sing, "Come thou fount of every blessing, and give me Jesus. In the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, give me Jesus." And I want to stress that these examples I have given are only some among many. There may not be a model for what you or someone else wants to do. You may have to create one. But people need to experience the domestic church to get ideas, to try making and praying with candles, or going on pilgrimage, or celebrating a saint's day, or chanting night prayer. And it helps to read up a little bit first to make that experience more meaningful. Here's the book plug. Hence my book. Hence the Field Guide. But I say this with the caveat that there will be spilt water and broken dishes and days when you're not feeling anything but discouragement and doubt. Karen Armstrong says that religion is a form of practical knowledge like swimming. You can talk about it all day long, but at some point you're going to have to jump in. And the way I swim involves wet hair and runny mascara. If you are blessing your house with small children, expect spilt water and dripped candle wax and people bumping into each other, and forgotten verses and mixed up words and disagreements and silliness and members of the household who would rather not be doing it at all. Because we are not actors or Instagram feeds, and our lives in Christ are not performances or filtered photos. They are real and messy and imperfect and redeemed. And the point is just to join in and keep doing it, because Christ came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. Jesus tells us that heaven is like a family. He says, "In my Father's house there are many rooms. I'm going to prepare a place for you that you may also be where I am." And at the heart of who God is Trinity, is community, is family. And we have a foretaste of heaven now in loving homes. I cannot let my own inadequacy stop me from even setting foot on the path. These practices are here to bless me, to form me, to retain me, not to shame me into surrender. Mercy does not mean permissiveness. It does not mean that my husband and I should scream at each other on the street. But it does mean that God retains us, even if we do. After the resurrection, Jesus appears to the apostles who are in hiding, and he breathes on them. It's so bodily and weird. He breathes on them, and he gives them the gift of the Holy Spirit. And he says, "Whose sins you forgive are forgiven. Whose sins you retain are retained." And as my friend Father Don Dilg reminded me the other day, he doesn't say whose sins you retain are unforgiven. He says they are retained, they are kept, they are held on to. At its best, the faith is like a family, an extended family that holds on to us, not to enable us, but to pray for and with us for as long as it takes for God's love to get through. The apostles don't throw out doubting Thomas. They hold on to him. They retain him until he can put his hand in Jesus' side and say, "My Lord and my God."